Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today on this Untapped Value of Corporate Website event. My name's Cam Gunn. I'm head of digital at Emperor. Emperor is a creative communications agency. We're about 200 partners strong. We became employee owned around a year ago. We're celebrating our 25th anniversary this year, which is quite exciting. And over the last 25 years, we've been lucky enough to work with all types of organizations really on their digital challenges, and particularly their corporate websites, all the way from your mega cap FTSE businesses all the way down to small cap AIM, government listed companies, private companies, partnership companies as well. So we've got quite a lot of experience in this space. This session's going to go for about 35 minutes, and we're going to cover a few different concepts. First, we're going to talk about the history of corporate website and how we got here. We're going to ask why we should talk about the value of this channel more than perhaps we are now. We're going to talk about what those elements of value are when talking about corporate websites. We're obviously going to give you some advice on how to unlock that value and then get into that Q&A. But first, let's have a little bit of a history lesson. I guess in the sort of mid 90s, late 90s is when brand and corporate websites really started becoming more of a priority for organizations as the internet started to take off. And you can kind of look at that sort of mid to late 90s period as like the Wild West of corporate websites in particular. No real standards and practices, no one really understanding what users wanted and how to work. And there was some significant constraints on us back then as well. You sort of step into the 2000s, the early 2000s, and that's when we really hit the first age of corporate websites and what I call the age of constraints. So those constraints were around connection speed. Obviously, we were working on very different connection speeds then, and they were around technology. So did we have the right technology to serve these websites in the way that we wanted to? We had to kind of work around technology more than work with technology at the time. And when you look back, you can kind of see what that looks like. So this is Nestle corporate site in 2001. And straight away, there's some things here that'll be familiar to some of you that have done this for a while. But the idea that all content had to appear on the screen at once, that above the fold concept that came over from the print world was really strong at this time, making sure everything was available, minimal photos and graphics because we just didn't have the memory, the space available to be able to serve that well. Really thin sort of content. This is all centered within the middle of the screen. If you look to GE, again, some use of color, black and white imagery, hard left in terms of it being aligned with the screen there. We used to do that a lot, that sort of hard left alignment as well. Even Coca-Cola was one of the better examples and has always been one of the better examples. And we sort of get into 2000 and, mid 2000s, 2009. Flash was still a really important technology and allowed people to do some really cool and interesting different things, maybe not always to the benefit of the user, but it was a really fun time to be in the space. And you can see here, even with the use of Flash and things like that, it's still all tucked up on the screen. So we kind of get out of the 2000s and into the 2010s and into 2012 in particular was a really banner year for this. And we move into the age of user experience. And this is when the sort of collective knowledge of the industry started to get better around what our users wanted and to take advantage of the advances in technology and the advancement in connection speed. Those were the big ones. But there's some things in particular that really stood out. Content management systems became far more robust and reliable. So we were able to create these broader and deeper sites really easily without having to hard code everything. It was easier for people to manage these websites internally. And the other thing that came in really strongly was obviously things like the iPhone. Really, the iPad is what really changed a lot of user behavior, but particularly organizational behavior. It was definitely the executive toy of choice at the time. So everyone wanted a website that worked on their iPad. And the other thing that came through really strongly was the concept of responsive design. So rather than building separate mobile sites for your website, we were able to create one single website that worked on these new mobile phone devices in a nice way. You can see Nestle.com here, far more interest on the page. We're back in the world of rounded corners and drop shadows and things like that, just from a stylistic point of view. Carousels are in, social media, you can see Twitter there is little bin. You can kind of recognize, I think, the sites of today in some of this work. General Electric, full bleed imagery in the background. As you scroll through the content, the image stays the same. So we're being far more bold in our aesthetic choices and design choices. But this was the game changer. This was the real game changer in this space. And it was when Coca-Cola came out with the Coca-Cola Journey, they called it, website, which was their corporate site. And that took the concept of corporate websites as being an investor tool with some corporate information and really flipped it on its head. And it became more about content and editorial and stories. This website made such a splash at the time, as ridiculous as it might sound now, that it made Reuters and then the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. And there was some real lovers and some real detractors. And no matter what you thought of it at the time, you can't argue that that content-driven approach, aligned to what users want, has really become the standard of corporate websites today. You can see it in Nestle, you can see that it's content driven. GE, really aesthetically bold. That's what the GE website looks like today. Big imagery, great user experience to get through. And Coca-Cola Company, although they've wound back the pure editorial magazine type format to a bit more of a traditional corporate site, you can sort of see that it's been the extension of that age of the user experience. But what next, I think, is probably the question that I ask myself around what's going to be that next age of corporate websites. And I think we need to start talking about the age of value. Our current approach around the age of user experience has served us and our users really well. And I think corporate websites are actually doing a far better job at serving users than some of our B2C counterparts. I mean, this is irrespective of what you think of the politics. dailymail.co.uk is one of the highest trafficked websites in the world. And this is the experience that they're serving up to their users. This is diabolical. It's disgusting. Between the notifications, advertising, banners, you can only see a little bit of the content in the middle. So we haven't fallen down that hole, which is good. But I think there's a good argument that corporate websites are getting a little bit samey and a little bit repetitive and familiar. And why is that? So being able to talk about value, I think, is a really good logical next step for us. And I think it's important for a couple of reasons. So for a really long time, there's kind of been this idea that your corporate website is your company brochure online. Historically, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And there's definitely a role for your website to be your company brochure. The problem is, if we only think about it as a brochure, it will only be treated as a brochure. And we're leaving all this potential that's built up in this channel on the table just because we're only looking at it in a certain way. And I think if the pandemic has taught us nothing else from a communications point of view, and I guess a stakeholder engagement point of view, is that digital is only going to become more and more important, certainly over the last 18 months and definitely moving forward. That pandemic has changed digital expectations forever. So this is a study from McKinsey, and they talked about what changes do the C-suite believe will stick post-COVID. And all of these changes are around changing customer needs, being more digitally enabled, servicing customers better, serving employees better through digital channels as they take a more hybrid or work from home approach as well. Increasing the use of technology, increasing spending on data security, etc. None of this would have happened without the pandemic. So those expectations of our users and our stakeholders, of us as individuals and of our organizations and C-suite has changed forever. And your corporate website is your manifestation of your approach to digital. So we need to make sure we're aligned with that. There's also some really useful and interesting research that's come out from our pals at Brunswick, where they interviewed a bunch of institutional investors to talk to them about what's the most important and trusted channel for you. And surprisingly, for the first time, investor relations website actually came out as not only the most used channel when investigating an issue, but also actually the most important channel when making an investment decision. And the thing that really jumped out at me was when it comes to trust. What do you trust more? Investor relations websites or corporate websites are scoring higher than Bloomberg, higher than the Wall Street Journal, higher than the BBC, higher than Thomson Reuters. These legacy media brands that have trust baked into them. Actually, your company website is seen as more trusted in the investor community. In the past, I think we've been quite complacent in being able to serve any sort of basic investor experience is good enough, because do they really use it, what do they want from it, how much, etc. Actually, this research just helps reinforce to us that this is a critical channel and should be treated as such. The C-suite is also paying attention to this. So again, this is something driven by probably the pandemic and that additional research from McKinsey. That sort of pre-pandemic, most of the C-suite was talking about digital as a cost-saving type approach. We want to be digital because we want to be more efficient and save costs. Now they're talking about digital as modernizing capabilities, using digital to become a competitive advantage, and actually refocusing the entire business model around digital. So around 20% of those respondents there are talking that. So if you're going to talk about value of your corporate website and this channel, now's the time to do it, because your C-suite is definitely paying attention to this. The last reason I think is to talk about value is probably aligned to you and us and people that are professional communicators in this space. I think if you can talk about value rather than pure delivery, that's really going to help you from your professional development in terms of how you're seen within your organization. I think it's going to help your team be recognized as a value-adding team and not just, perhaps as a cost center. If you can talk about the value you're bringing the organization, your team's going to get recognized appropriately. It's going to help drive your organizational success. So being able to align the value you create with your organizational's strategy and goals is really important. You're going to be able to demonstrate that value. And lastly, I think it's just a responsibility of the industry to progress this conversation. I have a belief that the effectiveness culture of B2C and B2B communications will come into corporate communications, and better that we're all on the front foot of that and driving that conversation and making sure that we're ahead of it, rather than just sort of waiting and talking about the brochure we have. So the journey that we really want to help take people on and believe that the industry should take is go from your corporate website is a company brochure to actually your corporate website is a business tool, and it adds exponential value into your business in a couple of ways. So let's talk about what those elements of value are. When we talk about value, what are those bits that we're looking at that we can point at and say, this is where I can help add value into our organization? I think there's kind of two homes for value in this space. There's the organizational value, so the stuff that you will create that's important for your organization, your company, and will add value to them. But then there's the user lens as well, the elements that will add value to their world. And I think we've got a responsibility to hit both sides of the coin. And when I look at the types of value, I think there's this idea of functional value, so elements that help serve a functional need. But then there's also something around emotional value, so something that helps serve an emotional need. And we're going to have a look at how those break down now. So when I look at organizational value, if I start at the top, I think there's a bunch of really interesting things that we can start talking about and leveraging and leaning into to have that value conversation internally. Things like purpose and using our website to demonstrate the positive role we make in the world, or signaling. So if you want to be known as a modern, innovative, agile tech brand, and maybe you're a legacy type organization, your website has a really big and important role, not just in communicating that message, but signaling that message, right? And helping to show you as the business that you want to be, and not necessarily the organization that people perceive you as. It's got a really strong role in mental availability. So great digital experiences create great memory associations with your audiences. That means people are going to be thinking about you when they need to be thinking about you. So it can help you build reach and help reach a wider variety of audiences, help you build fame, be famous for the things that you want to. It could help you with market growth, so achieving an excessive share of voice in your market, easier access to new audiences. Maybe you're stepping into a new region or committing to a new service line. Your corporate website has a really strong role in helping do that. Distinctiveness is something that we talk about a lot. So helping to stand out, not just from your competitors, but from the alternatives within your category. So you might be trying to hire a bunch of say software engineers in your business. You're not just competing against your peers, you're competing against Google and Facebook and all these tech brands. So, being distinctive in your communications will help attract those people. I think there's things around clarity, attraction, insight's a big one. Using this channel as a great insight generation tool. Now, that's going to be an interesting journey over the next sort of 18 months as the world goes steps away from third-party cookies, and we've got all the GDPR type guidance around what we can and can't track. But I think there's still a really strong role in your website being this big insight generation machine, and you can bring that knowledge into your organization. It's obviously a big relationship type channel as well. The idea that you can de-risk the business so you can show your alignment with stakeholders. You are who they expect you to be culturally, socially, environmentally, economically. You can get that message across. And when it comes to the more functional stuff, this is where that cost saving thing comes in. Reducing costs, reducing the acquisition of talent, reducing your time to hire, making sure that the people that you're attracting are the best people possible and they're staying for a long time. Attracting capital, attracting partners, whether they're innovation partners, supply chain, customer, clients, whatever it might be. Your website's got a big role in that. Workflow efficiency, helping to reduce the cost of serving those stakeholders. And then obviously the basic one is compliance. And when it comes to user value, I think this is where we can really tap into some big human emotions, helping to reduce anxiety around decision-making. Should I work here? Should I not? Should I apply for the job? Should I invest in this organization? Should I, get in touch with them to look to develop a relationship? I think the idea of helping to engender trust and confidence, demonstrating commitment, transparency, authenticity on their website is really important. You want your stakeholders to identify with your organization and have affinity with your organization. Obviously, a great website is going to help you do that. It's got a role in driving behavior, educating, and ultimately being useful and reducing effort. I came for what I need. I found what I needed. I'm confident to take my next action. You've made things easy for me. And now I think good things about your website and ultimately your organization. So there's kind of those two lenses on it, which I think is really important for us to tap into. Now, if that's all a bit much and you're sort of going, yeah, that's great, Cam, but what do I go back and tell my boss about the potential of what is in this channel? I think you would be pretty well served to go back and talk about, actually, with our website, I can help us create really positive associations with our brand, make people think good stuff about us. I can help us attract the talent we need. I can reduce the cost of stakeholder acquisition. I can help us become more efficient in terms of cost and time. I can bring insight into our business about who these people are. I can help us stand out from the pack. I can create demand and help grow the business. I can build relationships with our stakeholders. And when you start talking in that way and stop talking in, well, it's just a nice corporate brochure online, I think you put yourself and your team and your organization in a completely separate frame. But how to do it? It's easy to talk about. It's not necessarily easy to unlock because we're sort of fighting against, a couple of decades of that corporate brochure chat. And it's really important that we try and pragmatically and practically understand what those first steps are to unlock that value. I think there's 6 things that you should probably concentrate on in the first instance. The first is about identifying, well, what is the relevant value within this channel? So on those previous slides, there was a whole almost laundry list of different elements of value you can tap into. I think your role is to identify what's most useful for your organization. Maybe you've got a talent crunch coming up and you want to align with, actually, I can help us attract the right people in the right way, reduce our time to hire, and help attract a more diverse and talented candidate into this business. And that's really up to you and your organization to identify where that value is and to align yourself around that. That would be the first thing I would do. The second way, to tap into this is probably to create digital first. I think we still see a lot of websites where we're copying and pasting content from, say, the annual report, from different investor presentations, from internal things. you really want to take a digital first mindset to creating your content. People don't consume information online in the same way that they do in print. You don't read the same way. You're more scanning. Obviously things like reporting has its own sort of language and cadence, and it doesn't always translate brilliantly into the website world, into the digital world. So the content you create, I would strongly encourage you to create digital first. And I think that's going to be really important to help get all that value that you're after. It's just going to be a better digital experience by creating digital first. Something that we've been talking about with clients a lot now is the idea of, well, do we need a separate sustainability site, a separate careers site, separate corporate site? What do we do with the investor site? And this is quite a cyclical thing in this industry, but we strongly recommend that it should be one company, one voice on one platform. So that's making sure that there's one destination for your stakeholders, and they're able not just to get the narrow thing that they're after, but can see the breadth of what you're doing. The danger of obviously having separate sites is they don't get that full story. I completely understand the benefits that organizations feel they get around ownership and budget and etc. But I think if we're creating with our users in mind, it doesn't really serve the users better. And we should work harder to make sure that it's one company, one voice on one platform as much as possible. The fourth thing I would do is embrace different and be a little bit bold. The idea that you want to stand out. I think a lot of corporate communications, digital communications, the idea was that you kind of create a website that serves user needs, but you don't want to be too bold or too far out there. And I'm certainly not recommending that you create anything that's wacky or gimmicky or just off the wall for interest's sake. But I think you should have the courage to make the most of your brand and the distinctive assets of your brand, and try to be distinctive from your sector, from your category, whether you're in energy or finance or professional services, to show that you are different from your competitors, because you are different from your competitors and you want your website to show that. Number 5, make sure that it's fit for all. So that nearly every organization at the moment talks about diversity and inclusion as part of their corporate narrative and as part of what they do, and definitely is something that these organizations believe in. When we look at the digital experience, what we see is websites that aren't accessible for people that have different ways of accessing these websites and aren't really fit for purpose for the full breadth of stakeholders. There's a couple of reasons that I think accessibility and access to your website needs to be treated more seriously. Number 1, yeah, if you are going to talk about diversity inclusion, I think you have a responsibility to make sure that your channels are inclusive as possible. And probably number 2, which will ultimately drive this change, is this is the way legislation's heading already. If you look to California, EU, and even the UK, there's far higher demands on creating accessible websites in particular, and in the B2C world at the moment, but definitely will come to the corporate world. So we need to make sure that anything we create, we're creating with the whole breadth of our stakeholders in mind. People that have poor or lower vision, people that have trouble using mice and keyboards and use different sort of screen readers. I think definitely take the time to make sure your website does that. And number 6, right? Let's not beat ourselves up too much. It's a journey, right? This is a conversation that's going to take time to develop and to bring into your organization, and just embrace that journey. And if you can just be a little bit better and a little bit more focused on value, each day, every day, your website will get to where it needs to be. I'm sure your website has got a bunch of really great and interesting and useful user features, and I don't want us to get rid of that. I think what I want us to do is to embrace that journey to moving us from a corporate brochure conversation to a business tool conversation. How we look at that at Emperor is we talk about this concept of digital stakeholder experience and make sure that the websites and things that we create are memorable, motivating, and meaningful to unlock that value. We think if you do those 3 things, you're certainly on the path for creating the website or the digital stakeholder experience that's going to unlock that value. And if you're wondering on how can we start or see where we're getting, we've got a benchmarking tool that's available to you. And for those that have signed up to the session today, we're happy to talk you through that and offer that to you, that looks at not just the external benchmarking of your website, which obviously a lot of people do, but also have a look at, you know, what's happening internally. So we can identify quite quickly, you know, well, here's where some of those gaps are in particular to start and focus on. And here's where you're ranking in compared to your peers as well. If you are interested, please do get in touch and we'll happily have that conversation with you.